Welcome to our Pirkei Avot Shir. We're on chapter 4, Mishna 14. We're dedicating this episode, as ever, to the memory of Levy ben Moshe ben Esther and Elisheva Yael bat Leah ben Levy, and also in memory of Binyamin ben Moshe ben Esther. Okay, I'm going to hand you over to Michael.
Thank you, Mashiach. So this Mishnah, we're introduced to the words of Rabbi Yochanan Hasandla. And who was he? He was a Tana of the 2nd century CE, the 4th generation. This sage was one of Rabbi Akiva's last disciples to the very end of his master's life. He thus lived through the Emperor Hadrian's terrible persecutions, in which Rabbi Akiva died a martyr's death. While his master was imprisoned by the Romans, a question of law came before him which he could not decide alone. Disguised as a peddler, he passed by before Rabbi Akiva's cell and cried out, "Who needs needles? Who needs knitting hooks? What is the law in such and such a case?" The aged master looked through his window and replied, "Have you spindles? Have you kosher?" The last word gave the complete answer. Long after his master's martyrdom, Rabbi Yochanan Hasandla's was thus a recognized authority in the transmission of Rabbi Akiva's oral Torah, once overruling the brilliant Rabbi Meir. Apparently born in Alexandria in Egypt, he came to Israel to study with the great sages and fell so in love with the land that he could not leave it. Hadrian's relentless persecution eventually made him leave with Rabbi Elazar ben Shmuah for Nitzivim, there to study under Rabbi Yehuda ben Batria. At Sidon, they recalled the land they were leaving, and looking back, they found their eyes filled with tears for homesickness. They returned to home. His name indicates that by profession Rabbi Yochanan was a sandal maker, but evidently his menial calling did not prevent him from becoming a notable scholar. In general, the sages held labour in high regard, considering it a father's duty to teach his son an occupation, else he teaches him banditry. Amongst their sayings we find, and I quote, Greater is a man who benefits from the toil of his hands than a man who fears Hashem. And also, skin a carcass in the marketplace, and do not say, I am a distinguished man. Very interesting. So what does Rabbi Yochanan Hasandla say in his Mishnah? And I quote, Rabbi Yochanan Hasandla Omer, Rabbi Yochanan Hasandla said, Kol Knessia shehi l'shem shamayim. Every assembly that is for the sake of heaven, sofa his kayem, will endure in the end. V'she'ena l'shem shamayim, ein sofa his kayem. But anyone that is not for the sake of heaven will not endure in the end. So, we learn in Midrash Tanchuna, and I quote, just as their visages differ, no one is like another, so are their views never alike, one to another. Interesting. Then how can we hope for understanding and agreement? So what is the difference? What makes the difference between communities and gatherings of people? What is the difference between a successful one and one that is bound for not to work? And the difference is doing something for the sake of heaven. In fact, Rambam, I believe, urges us to do everything in our life l'shem shamayim. To sanctify, you can sanctify anything, but even more so, a community-wide project will succeed if it's done l'shem shamayim, and perhaps the opposite if it's not done l'shem shamayim. So what does Rav Chaim of Volozhin say about this? He says about a gathering which is for the sake of heaven will eventually endure. And I quote, when a man performs a mitzvah, he creates holy worlds in the upper spheres. These worlds are reserved as his reward in the world to come, a time when he will delight in them forever. A similar system applies to sin. And I quote from Yeshayahu 49:17, your ruiners and destroyers come from you. A man creates his own ruin with his action. After man dies, he must enter these dismal worlds and receive his due punishment. After the sin has been expiated, these worlds dissolve, since their entire existence is dependent upon sin. Worlds created through mitzvah observance, a creation founded in holiness, remain forever. Any gathering of worlds that are for the sake of heaven, such as worlds born of mitzvot, will endure. Any gatherings of worlds that are not for the sake of heaven, such as worlds created through sins, will not endure. For eventually the sins will be expiated and these worlds will disappear. And just another commentary on the worlds will disappear. Gehinnom is called aluka, a leech. Leech sucks a disease from a person and dies. So too, Gehinnom absorbs the evil from a person and then dissipates. This is from his other great book, Nefesh HaChaim. So very interesting words from Rav Chaim of Volozhin. Yes. So it's also, when we talk about the concept of it's worth noting that it is quoted in the Talmud in Kiddushin 30b, even a father and his son, or a teacher and his pupil, who occupy themselves with Torah and study at one gate, become enemies to each other. Yet they do not budge from there until they have become friends. When people study Torah intensively, seeking to find its true meaning, sharp differences of opinion will arise, but ultimately, because this is L'Shem Shamayim, this is things will turn out well. And also, we looked at the actual words used in the Mishnah about the gathering. Kenesia. Kenesia is there's a shorter form of this word, which is a kinus, which will do just as well. But here, Rav Yochanan brings the word kenesia, which he could have used kinus, but the longer word has two letters that have been added, yod and hey. And by themselves, these form the name of Hashem. So if you add a kinus, you add Hashem to it, you get Kenesia. So this connotes an assembly dedicated to the values and purposes of Hashem, and that can have constructive endings. And there was also something that is mentioned in Gemara Yoma 22b. Any scholar of Torah who does not exact revenge and seek satisfaction like a serpent is no Torah scholar. This is a very, very strange thing to say. But if perhaps you look at it as a simile, you could understand it. When two people get together and they do learn L'Shem Shamayim, they actually act like how would you describe it? As when you describe snakes, one. They have the same want of an outcome, is that they learn the truth from Torah. But each of them wants to kind of outdo each other and maneuver each other with its thoughts and ideas, like a serpent would perhaps find the best angle by toing and throwing side to side, thinking of different ways of interpreting this certain Torah concepts. And then once his fellow Chavrusa has perhaps deemed something, perhaps he will strike like a viper with his counter argument. So perhaps in that respect, you could say that there is a simile involved here. And also, but also in when you're learning Torah and great Talmidei Chachomim get together, it's not like scientists who get together at a convention and they're fearful of sharing their information with each other. You find that persons who are Talmidei Chachomim who are discussing Torah are proud to present their findings. They're proud to share them, and in fact you feel the kedusha that is brought from when one person is corrected. Sometimes scientists or other people in the secular fields feel offended when their view is not taken, or when their view is knocked down by better theories. They feel offended. But no, the Talmidei Chachomim together feel enlivened by a new understanding. This is very important. So this is quite interesting. But now I'd like to talk about the Avot de Rav Natan, which is like a parallel Pirkei Avot, and they talk about a point in history when we stood at Sinai as an example of an assembly that is L'Shem Shamayim. Ever since then, Bnei Yisrael have studied and restudied the Torah, the words and the ways of Hashem, and over the centuries, an endless series of assemblies for the sake of heaven continue. So, which of these assemblies can endure? Only one that wants to further the purposes of Hashem or heaven. Such assemblies join the great continuing chain of permanent construction engineers, like the students and teachers of Torah. And what is the opposite of that? We have learned about the groups like the Sadducees, who also gathered to organize into assemblies, but their purpose was not for the sake of Shemayim or the sake of heaven. They were moved primarily by an underlying desire for power or assimilation, and they suffered the inevitable fate of such an assembly. So where are the Sadducees today? Where are the Karaites? And likewise, people who rejected the oral law at a later period. They have sunk without trace over time. Even as recently as 18th century Germany, the Haskalah movement arose, and its noble purpose, or seemingly noble purpose, was to enlighten Jewry by subjecting Judaism to scientific analysis, and by demonstrating that our Torah contains a literature of great cultural merit. But they ignored the essential character of the Torah as divine tradition and rejected the spiritual truth with which it is instinct. Also, you can look at another passage in Avot de Rav Natan, and he talks about which is the assembly for the sake of Hashem. For instance, the gathering of our Bnei Yisrael before Mount Sinai, and what is not for the sake of heaven, is the gathering of the Dar Haflaga, which is the generation of dispersion. So, who gathered at Mount Sinai? It was a multitude of recently liberated slaves that came to the foot of the mountain to receive the Torah. So how much discipline could they have had? How regimented were they, and how united were they in appearance? But we read in the Torah, we read in Exodus 19:2, the people encamped Vayihen there opposite the mountain. The Midrash noted the verb Vayihen is in the singular to indicate that they were there as one people, and they were one heart unified by underlying affection as they prepared to receive the Torah. They were solidly united in a Knessia L'Shem Shamayim. And what about the Dar Miflaga, the generation of dispersion? There we read many people were indeed involved. I think there was something like 600,000 that were there to build the Tower of Babel, and which is a similar number to the amount of Bnei Israel that left Egypt.
Yes, yeah.
So one was L'Shem Shamayim and one was not L'Shem Shamayim. They were efficient in some ways in terms of building this construction, but we know that they were scattered to the four corners of the earth, and their whole project was unworthy and a waste of time. So it's interesting that this. That's also one other last comment in. You see sometimes Hashem's hand in modern times, even as recently as World War II, where seemingly extremely powerful, almost unstoppable force is stopped and is dispersed and is destroyed. I believe L'Shem Shamayim. A fantastic example of this is the Nazis World War II, the Third Reich's will to dominate the world and create their own version of humanity, which when you saw how they were taking over the world at the beginning of World War II, any normal person would conclude that they would have won the war. But it's incredible, and it still amazes me to today, that the West was able to overcome them convincingly in the end. And I believe this is with the help of Hashem, and shows the hand of God, that anything that is not L'Shem Shamayim will be forced to disintegrate and become nothing, whatever the force that initially propelled it. So that's Mishna 14 of Pirkei 4.
Fantastic, thank you so much, Michael. Next week, Mishna 15, we'll be discussing Rabbi Elazar ben Shemua. And until then, we wish you a wonderful and blessed week.